Great. Thanks, Will. And good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Just want to thank you for coming to our webinar this morning. So we're here, of course, to talk about design systems. I've had a bit of experience with them. I think they're pretty great, but I do think there are some things that are good to be aware of as well. And so we'll get into that a bit this morning. And then once we do that, we'll take a look at a little case study of some work that we were able to do with the government of Alberta on their design system. And then that'll kind of be our last section before we close off with some questions from you. So we'll get started. And so I'm sure everybody here has a varying level of experience with design systems. Some of you may be more familiar than others, maybe some of you not so much. But I think it would be good just for everybody to reset for a minute so that we can all start from the same page. So what is a design system, right? And I do have to apologize in advance if you're not a Star Wars fan. We're just going to nerd out a little bit here, but bear with me. So as an example, let's just say that you went out and you bought this collector's edition of the Lego Millennium Falcon, right? You bring it home, you're super excited, and now you're ready to build this thing. So you open up the box. But inside the box, you find there's over 7,500 pieces. And they're all going to be basic Lego parts. They all kind of look like this. And now these parts on their own don't really amount to much, right? Like one of these pieces on its own is a pretty far cry from a completed Millennium Falcon. So they're not really that useful until you piece them together like this. And slowly, as you make your way through the booklet of instructions, through the 1,000 plus steps that it takes to finally build this whole thing, hopefully, and eventually you will arrive at something like this. So how do you go from bare pieces to the finished product? What enables you to do that? And actually, just in those few slides that we went through, we basically covered what a design system is made up of. So let's break it down. So we talked about how in our Lego kit that you have these basic building blocks, right? Well, in a design system, you have foundations. So these are things like color, typography, icons, or any layout elements. And just like the basic Lego pieces, they don't do a whole lot on their own. And just as you would combine Lego bricks to create more functional pieces, you would combine your design system's foundational pieces to create components. And thankfully, unlike with Lego pieces, in the digital world, we can actually just build components once and reuse them however we want. So these are things like your buttons, cards, accordions, user profile elements, basically anything that you would see multiple times in a product. And so you continue on building out these components, and they all get pieced together at some point to become key pieces to your digital products. So then that brings us to who uses a design system. And the answer to that is quite simple. Of course, designers use it. It's in the name, right? Design system, but also software engineers, right? Developers. And that's what makes design systems such a powerful tool, is that it's designed to be used collaboratively by everybody on the team. But that's not going to be easy if you only just have the foundations and components. So in order to make a system usable, you need strong documentation. And that includes more than just explaining the designed components, but you also need to provide guidelines around them as well. I think a good way to think of it is if someone new came in and read the documentation, would they be able to understand how to use the system? Like, would they know what the do's and the don'ts are? And something else you want to think about too is the principles that drive your design system, right? So that your team can use that to align on thinking and decision making. So to wrap up our metaphor here, these pieces on their own, they don't do a whole lot. But now if you combine them together, you can build components. And if you include documentation, that sort of changes everything, right? So these pieces over here, those are your foundations. That is the component that you've built up using the foundations. And this entire piece here is the instructions that tell you how to use the pieces. And that's super important, right? Because could you imagine trying to build this entire model without having proper documentation? Like, that'd be pretty difficult, right? And the great thing is that because all of this becomes your source of truth, you can then use it to build new products, you can make changes, and you can make updates. So good guidelines around how you handle all of these different pieces is really important to a successful design system. Now, if we look at the chart here, you can see that there's one last piece, right? Well, what is that? It's governance. And you need a good governance system in place to handle all of these different types of things. For example, how do you handle contributions and approvals? How do you handle versions and updates? And it might be okay to not have all of this fully locked down in the beginning, but definitely something that you want to think about, since having these processes in place can save you from potential issues. Or, let's hope this never happens to anyone, right? The worst case scenario. But things can happen, right? Mistakes happen, glitches can happen, problems can happen. Hopefully not as drastic as this, but having good processes and documentation can go a long way in preserving your team's work. So looking at our chart again, a design system is a collection of basic building blocks with reusable components. It's used by both design and software engineering, and it's supported with great documentation and processes. So that's a lot of moving parts, right? And now you might be wondering, well, why go through all that trouble? Like, is it worth it? What are the benefits? And so I'll highlight just a few. And the first is that you get to speak the same language. And I think anytime that we have to work together with other people on a team, that means that good communication is important, right? So just as an example, let's take a look at the intranet that we use here at OXD. What would you call this piece that I've highlighted in red? Would you call it an app bar, global header, top bar, sidebar? Right? Technically, none of them are wrong, but there's two things to think about here. One is that depending on who you talk to, you'll probably get a different answer. And second, a difference in terms means that there's also room for confusion, right? For example, if someone calls it a global header, are they referring to the red box, the yellow box, or are they talking about both? So wouldn't it be great if everyone on your team could agree on what to call something? But that's the reality, right? Different people from different backgrounds and teams means that there is going to be a difference in language. So when you open that conversation about what's what, you can land on shared vocabulary that everybody agrees and understands, and then you can use that shared language to move forward, and you'll have a stronger base of communication within your team. The next point is around change. And here I'm not really talking about the design system itself, but the reality is that teams change, organizations change, and technologies change, right? And these things can change quickly, especially companies, right? People get hired, people can quit, layoffs can happen. We've seen that in the news lately. People can get promoted, they can shift around to different positions. So how do you deal with the knowledge that leaves with these people who have been around for a long time? And even if you were to do like some kind of knowledge transfer, how do you make sure that that stays organized and communicated to other people in the company? So a design system can help with these situations because you have that documentation and those governance processes in place that's built to handle these types of situations. Something else to think about too, right, is outside of the browser, because design systems aren't just limited to screens only, because you can provide documentation for just about any interface, right? We have voice-only interfaces, we have emerging technologies like VR and AR, or maybe even the metaverse someday. Now, the third point, the last point that I want to go over is around your job, right? If you're a designer or a developer, and I told you that a design system could maybe help you have a little more fun at work, would you believe me? So if you're a designer or a developer, just think about your career and how many buttons you've had to design or build. And I'm not saying that there's only one way to do this, but typically in most cases, you're not really reinventing the wheel. But then you might think, it's a button, right? How much effort really goes into that? But you might think, designer goes into Figma, they pick a color, draw a rectangle, and type in a label, and done, right? But think about the overall effort. Yes, you do need design for the thinking and the visuals, but you also need development to come in and build out the functionality, build out the different states, and think about things like localization, if that's a factor in the product that you're building. And QA then has to come in and do bug testing, make sure that it works as intended across all your different platforms. And some QA teams may even do another level of accessibility checking. And all of this, that's a fair bit of involvement, right? And if you have to do that over and over again, I don't think that's fun or a good use of time. So instead of doing that over and over again, if you can take advantage of a design system and use components, you know that you're going to get a consistent experience for that button wherever you use it, because your team's already designed it, they've already built it, and they've already tested it. So nobody's worried about it, about whether or not it's going to fail or have any problems. So the team can then focus on building out new features, new products, or improving the existing experience and just adding that extra level of polish. I don't know about you, but that sounds a lot more fun than constantly working on things that you've already done. But wait, what's the difference between a design system and style guides, component libraries, and pattern libraries? And I'm sure you've heard these terms before, right? Sometimes maybe even interchangeably. But the fact is that each one of these pieces are just a part of a design system. And if we take a look at each one, for example, style guides, if you come across a style guide, typically what you're going to see is guidance around the basic building blocks that we talked about earlier, right? Color, typography, icons, layout elements, etc. And for component libraries, as the name suggests, it literally is a component library, right? This is where all of the building blocks that you've used to create components, this is where they get collected for your reference. Excuse me. So those are things like your buttons, cards, form fields, and etc. Which brings us to the pattern library. And this is where you see guidance on how the components that you've built can be used to solve user needs and user problems. And this is really where your team's thinking is put on display, because this is where you capture the decisions on when to use the components for which problem, and you provide guidance on how to do it. So all of these pieces, they're used by both design and development. And just one thing that I want to say about this chart is that the way that it's organized here is not the definitive way to do it, because not every organization is the same, right? So for example, some design systems may feature accessibility as more of a foundational element, and they might include that as part of their style guide, where others might view it even more important and treat it as a completely separate section. So there is some variance, and it just really depends on your needs. So now, if we were to put a face to each of these three pieces, what does that look like within a design system? And if we look at Atlassian's design system here, you can see they've pretty clearly broken it out. They've got components, they've got patterns, and they've got their style guide, which they're calling foundations. Whoops, sorry. Technical difficulty. Yes, so Atlassian. And we come to Shopify's Polaris. They've got the same thing, design, components, patterns, but you'll also notice content, right? That's a separate thing, which is an example of that variance that we talked about. Then we look at IBM's Carbon design system, and they've kind of got the same thing. They've got guidelines, components, and patterns. But if Shopify had content, then IBM has contexts, because maybe you build products for different audiences, right? One might be external, one might be internal for your employees. It might be more of a tool that they use to get their job done. So we look at what IBM did here, and they've got something called productive and expressive use cases. So one's internal facing, the other's external. So this is another great thing about a design system, is that it gives you the space to collaborate on and capture these types of decisions. So we've covered these three areas pretty thoroughly, and that leaves us with governance, right? What about governance? What does that look like? Who's involved? And when it comes to design system governance, there's a really great article on this on Medium. It's called Team Models for Scaling a Design System. It's written by Nathan Curtis. And in it, he talks about three governance models. One, solitary, centralized, and federated. And each one, of course, has their own pros and cons. So the first one, solitary, right? This is where one person owns the design system. It primarily serves one team or one product. And that's fine, right? But that can begin to become a problem if you start to need to scale up to serve multiple teams or multiple products, because at some point, because you have just one person overseeing the design system, inevitably they will at some point become the bottleneck, right? But the great thing about the solitary model is that you can move very quickly, more quickly than any of the other models. And this is a model that you might typically see more in startups or smaller companies kind of before they started to see growth. The second is the centralized model. And so this is where you have a full-time dedicated design system team. That's what their job is to work on the design system. And that's great because you know that it's going to be well maintained. The processes are going to be well thought out, and there's no product bias, right? It's because this team is dedicated to working on the design system. They don't have any kind of product specific bias coming in. But that's also kind of the downside, is that they're missing that context and they're missing those product specific challenges. So this is something you might see more in larger or enterprise level companies. The third is the federated model. And so this is where you have multiple teams within your company, and you have a representative from each one coming together to form like this design system collective to maintain and help run this design system. And this excels kind of where the centralized model doesn't, because you're able to bring that unique product specific insight to the table. But again, kind of like centralized, the upside is also kind of the downside, right? Because each member belongs to a different product team. That means that product tasks may take priority over the design system. So that can cause the design system to stagnate a little bit. Then we have a little bit of a bonus. This is the hybrid or cyclical model. And this is a blend of the centralized and the federated, right? So you still have that dedicated team that's working on the design system full time, but you also have federated members. So you get that context from the different products. So you get the benefit of having both makers and users with this model. So we covered the 4 areas of a design system: foundations, components, guidelines, and governance. I think the last thing to understand is around the levels of maturity and what the different stages look like. So there's a model called the hierarchy of needs from Abraham Maslow. It states that everyone is motivated by a series of needs, and each level must be met in order to progress to the next level. And if we apply that to a design system, it looks like this. So let's say, for example, you're starting up a brand new company. In the beginning, you go from absent, you go from having nothing to the first step, nascent. And really here, you're just getting started. You're just really blazing a new trail with design work that hasn't quite been standardized or documented yet. And so you're working on that. And as you, over time, you take the next step to basic. So here you're building on the last step. Your company's got some time in now, it's had some growth, and you've had some time to figure out kind of the basic components and the documentation, but it's still not quite there in terms of being like a fully collaborative tool. So then you take another step and you get to integrate it. And now you're in a spot that allows the design system to stay in sync between designers and developers. And here's where you'll start to see maybe some more governance processes take shape. You might see things like a version release cadence start to get established here. And then you take another step. You get to distributed. And now you're building a number of different products with a number of different teams. And now people can contribute to the design system. Your governance processes have had some more work and your documentation is pretty solid. Then the last step is optimized. So this is really where the machine is really well oiled, right? Now you've got automation in place. Some companies have it so they can output components once and it automatically does it for all of the platforms that they build for. Companies like Uber create their own Figma plugins that let them update a bunch of components at once. You can see here, they're changing the label for all of their buttons and badge components at once through this plugin that they've built. So this is the step where really everybody's bought into the design system, and now it's a really powerful and efficient tool. So one thing I do want to say about all of this is that it's not to say that you have to get to the optimized stage or you failed, right? It's not saying that all of the other steps before that are useless, and because it's not. And the way even I've organized this maturity model, this progression, isn't the way that every organization is going to approach it, right? Everyone's model is going to look different based on their priorities and their needs and the way that the organization is structured. So that's just something to keep in mind with this model here. And that brings us to our case study with the government of Alberta on their digital delivery and innovation. And we were just one of many vendors who helped Alberta with this project. And if we take a look at their design system process, Alberta took the hybrid approach. So they had designer and developer representatives from across the organization. They had a single lead. And there's a big shout out here to Mark Alamantha. He's a practitioner on a team who's doing the work, but is also responsible for managing and maintaining the system. Every month, then they would have everybody who was working on an Alberta application, whether they were internal or contractors, they would all come together at this show and tell to share what they were working on with a focus on new designs, new patterns, and edge cases. And then all of these tasks would get added to the backlog. And if you go to GitHub, you can actually look up GovAlta, and you'll be able to take a closer look at this board. Then at the weekly level, there's core team meetings where they review the backlog, they groom the board, and they choose what to work on based on priority and urgency. And then those tasks are assigned based on who's available from the federated pool of resources. And as the design system gets worked on, it gets moved from design into development. And throughout this process, the designers are always in communication with the developers to try and understand like what opportunities exist, what constraints there are, and just to try to understand the impact that design decisions can have. And from there, the design system updates would go out in sprint-based releases, and they would also include product and site updates. So that's what Alberta's design system kind of looks like at a process level. In terms of seeing it in action and in application, we'll take a look at a few examples of some products that were built using the DDI. So this one here is an application for subsidy management in childcare programs. This is an internal tool used by employees. These are applications built to replace paper-based courtroom clerk processes. And the one on the right is to track adjournments in court. This one is a court case management system. So this allows people to upload documents that are relevant to cases. And this one is an application that was used to track financial aid requests. So just quickly looking at them, you may have noticed that they don't all look identical to each other, right? But you could definitely tell that they were from the same family. So maybe more like distant cousins than siblings. So why is that? What factors play into that? And in Alberta's case, there's a few reasons that play into these results. First was that the design system was treated like an ever-evolving product. So it was always being iterated upon. The next is that there were different teams. So some were more feature focused, some had different budgets, and that all can play into how much they adhere to the design system. Another factor is that products were built when the design system was still in its infancy. And the reality is that sometimes products just evolve faster than the design system can keep up. And due to the maturity of the design system at the time, it may not have necessarily provided guidance around all the different edge cases or product specific cases. So teams would then have to create their own solutions. And the last thing is that there was no mandate at the time. There was no mandate for complete compliance. And all of this really is just a consequence of their rapid growth and success. And it's just part of the process, really. But over time, as they iron more things out, consistency will become more of a theme. So they're not identical looking, but we did mention similarities. So what do these products have in common? And to get a sense of that, we can start to look at things like the headers, the stepper components, the tables, and things like navigation tabs. And so these examples show the importance of patterns within a design system, right? If you have several products, needs can vary for each one. So even though in the examples that we looked at, the styles and components, they might look a bit different, but you can still achieve a level of consistency in the patterns of how they get used. So even if stylistically they're not identical, they can still feel similar. And that brings us to the conclusion. And we did go through a lot today, but I'm glad we were able to do it. And some of you may have attended this morning to get a better understanding of design systems. And of course, the reason for why, I'm sure, varies from person to person. But just before I finish up here, I wanted to wrap up a few points for you to walk away with. I think first is that if you're considering a design system, I think it's really good to think about this question, right? Is it necessary? And if the answer is yes, that's great. But just take a moment and really think about it, like whether or not you need a design system. Like, what problem would a design system solve for you? And second, another thing to think about is, are you currently set up to use a design system successfully? Do you have people in place who can take ownership of it and really advocate for it up and down the organization? And success requires commitment, right? Can you commit to a design system? As obvious as that sounds, the last thing you want to do is to invest all this time and money into a design system, have a great start to one, but not have the process or the people in place to let it really be successful. And the last one is that design systems are more like a tool or a service, right? And one thing I want to say is that I think design systems have kind of been popularized in a way that people are talking about them. A lot of people are talking about them. They're talking about the benefits. You see a lot of companies sharing their design systems. It's almost kind of like this trendy thing that, and people can start to think that, that they need a design system. But the reality is that it's not a thing like a website, right? It's not meant for consumption. Like I said, it's a tool or a service, and it's meant to enable collaboration and enable you to build products. And like the second point says, it takes a commitment. And it's a big change, right? Using a design system, it changes how you work at a team level, but also at an individual level. And it changes the way you build things. And it is a lot of work. Like it involves a lot of good communication, a lot of good teamwork. But if you do take the right steps to implement it, the result is that it can help you build better, faster, and more efficiently. So those are the takeaways that I wanted to leave you with. I'd like to just thank everybody once again for attending our webinar this morning. And we'll have time for your questions, I think.
Yeah, thanks, James. That was great. It was really useful. Covered a ton in a short amount of time. Yeah, we've got some questions coming in, so we're going to get right into it. And a reminder, please send us your questions through the Q&A feature in Zoom, and that'll queue it up for us, and we can get to them. So we've got about 10 minutes left or so, and we'll get to as many as we can. So let's get to this first one here. First one from Suha. How do you start building a design system in the middle of a project where a lot of the design components were created by various designers, where you are building on top of designs you don't know the context of?
Yeah, that's a wow, that's a really good question. I think that's kind of a tricky situation, right? Like, yeah, like, yeah, that could get, I could see how that could get a little bit difficult. I think the best thing to do maybe in that situation is kind of like to take a step back and look at what you have. Look at what you have and look at what inconsistencies exist. And I think another thing to think about too is the direction, right? If you have a solid direction, if you have good principles in place, then you can start to begin to align kind of your decisions moving forward. Yeah, that's a really tricky situation. It's really just to kind of look at what you got and think about what kind of things can you use to align and get on that page, if that kind of answers your question.
I think, James, it also goes back to what you were saying about why do you need a design system, right? And if you're in the middle of a project, making sure that you're like strategically aligned with some decision, and it's not just because you think you need a design system, but because it actually would serve some sort of purpose towards the end goal. And I think something else that we've done in projects, James, is like just start somewhere, right? Pick a button. or buttons are hard. Pick a heading, pick headings, right? Start like James said, do your overview, see where you're at, see what you've got to work with, kind of understand all the moving pieces, and then be like, okay, where's one small part that we can start working on this and starting to chip away at it.
Yeah, I think the other thing too is to try, like, if you don't know the context, I think that's important to understand is what is the context? Like if like just figure out like who can you talk to, what can you read to understand that context better, and even that can help you get a better picture of what to do next.
Yeah, that's great. Communication, that's the thing about design systems, isn't it? Talking to people and learning from what you're working with.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right, we've got a couple more questions here. This is from Kuldeep. How would we measure success when building a design system for an early stage startup? So measuring success, how would you measure success for building a design system?
Yeah, I mean, if you're starting with a design system from the get-go, that might be hard, like, because then you won't really have anything to compare it against. But if you didn't and you are moving towards like a design system, I think it's good to start with a small project to really be like to see how long would it, because if you have some experience like thinking about how long it takes you to build something without a design system, if you have a design system and you're early and you're starting with a small project, kind of like a pilot project, you'll be able to kind of see, like if I have all these components in place to build out different pages, for example. Because typically, like if you weren't using a design system, you're more like building out these components over and over again, right? But if you're taking advantage of a component system and a design system, then it just becomes a matter of piecing these components together to create patterns and pages. So I think that's kind of the way, is you kind of have to see what that looks like.
All right. Another question here. Oh, this is interesting. Okay. So Chris asks, how does UX input and benefit from a design system? So specifically speaking to the UX practice and UX practitioners, I guess, apart from UI designers or visual designers?
How does UX input and benefit from a design system? Well, I think that's kind of like, again, right? It's a tool that you all come together, all the different disciplines come together and work on together, right? I think being able to capture and document all of the different design thinking and the design decisions, I think that's beneficial for the whole team, not just the UX. So it's, and once you have all those decisions captured, then you can use that moving forward to solve different problems or similar problems if you encounter them again. And it just allows you to have that consistency if all of that's documented.
Actually, that capturing piece, James, is something that I think might resonate, right? Like, how many times have we been in a project and like UX has their sort of like knowledge base, and like the visual designers have their knowledge base, and like developers have their knowledge base, and we're trying to collaborate across different teams and disciplines. But yeah, like you said, having a decentralized place where you can document decisions and have them be accessible to everybody, that's awesome, right? I think that alone is worth the price of admission for a design system.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you're able to capture that thinking, like I'm guilty of this. Is like sometimes I just assume people know what I'm thinking, but that's not the case, right? And a design system lets you have those conversations and lets you capture those decisions so that everybody on the team now knows what you're thinking. And yeah, I think that's a big benefit too.
Mm-hmm. Here's a really good question. I think this comes up a lot for designers, particularly from Samara. Do you have any advice for how to help non-technical leadership understand the value of a design system and tips for building a business case?
Yeah, that's that's always a tricky one, right? It's like, how do you sell a design system, basically, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a few things that you have to think about here. First, it's good to know your audience, like with anything else. And once you do know them, speak their language, right? Like if they're leadership that values efficiency, like speak that language, right? If you don't have a design system, you can say like, here's how we're doing things now. Here's where things could be. Are they more about like budgets and data? Then like speak that language, right? Do some research, show them a case study of how a design system helped out an organization. On the other hand, like, do your leaders know what a design system is, and do they really care? Because I think the cold reality is that sometimes they don't. Like I've been in a situation where I've explained a design system, like, and the benefits, and I could just see like their eyes glossing over and they're just smiling and nodding. And it kind of reminds me of like that classic example of a drill, right? Nobody wants a 1/4-inch drill, like they want a 1/4-inch hole. And if you take that one step further, nobody wants a 1/4-inch hole, they want to hang a picture, right? So same thing, like sometimes people don't really care about the how, they just want the thing that it lets you create. So I think when you're considering a design system, it goes back to that point, right? It's almost like, do you really need one? Because again, it's not a thing, it's not meant for consumption. It is a tool that just enables you to build products.
That's great. And I think we've got time for one quick more question here. Let's see. Can you recommend any good tools to manage a design system?
Yeah, there's quite a few out there now, actually. Storybook is a really popular one. There's also Supernova and Zero Height, I think, which are quite similar. And InVision has Design System Manager. If you're looking for like an open source one, Pattern Lab is also good. So there's a lot of tools out there. It's just a matter of kind of evaluating them and picking which one kind of fits your needs.
Awesome. All right. Well, that almost puts us at 1/4 and we want to get folks out and rolling. If you do have extra questions, there's a few more that came through, but feel free to email us and we'll get back to you with some of our answers there. Thanks again, James, for sharing your experience and knowledge. Hopefully we've managed to lift the veil a little bit on design systems for people. Thank you to our guests for attending. There's a bunch of resources that will be included with the follow-up. So check your email over the next few days. You can get the deck, a nice big slide of resources for further reading. And also let us know what topics you'd like to hear more about by emailing us at marketing@oxd.com. So consider joining us for our next webinar. It's going to be happening early next year. We're going to take a little bit of a break for the rest of this year. And stay tuned to our social channels and our newsletter for registration details. Thanks again, James. Thanks again, everybody else. Happy Thanksgiving again to our US friends, and have a great rest of the week, everybody. Take care.